I was a senior when this happened. Senioritis had fully kicked in. It was football season. Our high school was always big on football games because our football team was actually good, and there's nothing else to do in our boring country-ass town. One day at school, we were in some joke of an elective. My friend JJ was in this class with me, so we'd always mess around. It was a Friday, and there was a football game later that day, so we planned to go. And JJ, being the sweet talker he's always been, spun his chair around to face these girls Kayla and Ashley and asked them to go to the football game with us. We already knew them well, so it wasn't weird of him to invite them or anything. They seemed down to meet us later, so JJ dropped me off at home after school, and like 4 hours later, he picked me up, and then we picked up Kayla and Ashley. Then we drove to the school back parking lot by the woods. We had some Four Locos in the car, making sure nobody was passing by. Then we poured some more into water bottles to bring to the bleachers with us. We walked over to make sure we got good seats at the top row of the bleachers. Since the game started late, it started getting dark during the third quarter, and by the fourth quarter it was dark. Our team was losing pretty bad for a change this game, so bad even that a lot of the kids in the bleachers were leaving early. We just stayed, planning on hanging out on the field after anyway. The game ended and our team lost really bad, and so the field and bleachers were quiet. People were scurrying off the bleachers. The team rushed back inside the locker room in embarrassment, and the away team slowly made their way back to the buses. Within 10 minutes, we were among the only people left in the bleachers, minus a couple others and maybe a couple people in the field. We were honestly drunk by this point, and the team's defeat wasn't ruining our fun. When the field lights turned off, it was basically pitch black here minus the moonlight. Everyone was gone. We went to go lay in the field. JJ ran to his car to get more alcohol. By now, it was probably 10 o'clock. JJ said let's go in the woods next to the football field. The girls of course were scared, and that's why the idea seemed fun. When they wouldn't budge, we both got up and ran towards the woods, leaving them alone in the dark, knowing they'd get scared and follow us, which they did. We crawled under the little ripped chunk of fence that kids would use to get into the woods, and then started walking down the little hill into the woods. The girls were very reluctant to follow, but they did. We ran ahead to lose them and hide just to mess with them. As soon as they heard us running, they both yelled to stop. They tried to keep up, but we lost them and hid behind a couple trees. We hid and laughed for a few seconds. Then JJ patted me and told me to look in that direction. And though it was dark, we could see, perhaps only because of the moonlight barely finding its way through the trees, a towering black figure, maybe 15 feet away from us, standing between two trees. It was a horrifying sight. Then they spoke. It was a woman's voice, and she said, "You kids shouldn't be in here." We just stood there and looked in silence at the figure of the apparent woman. But we both noticed she seemed to be getting bigger and closer very quickly, yet we didn't see the legs moving, or what we assumed were legs. And we heard no footstep sounds. JJ and I turned and ran. We ran and called the girls' names until we found them. Then they followed us out of the woods. We told them to just follow us to the car and run. At the car, we finally told them that some 7-foot-tall woman was in the woods. JJ said that if I hadn't seen it as well, he would have thought that he saw an apparition. The girls were freaked out, asking us to tell them that we were kidding, but we weren't. We watched from the car to see if anyone came out of the woods. No one ever did. The biggest question is, why would an older woman be in there at night alone? It's not like it was a nature trail, it was a fenced-off wooded area. Our school didn't have security back then either, so it wasn't that. The four of us went to go hang out at JJ's after, and I'll leave the rest of that night to your imagination. Now we're really fast-forwarding to that summer, when I was working at the school one final time as a summertime custodian, since I got a raise every summer that I'd return. There were about 4 of us in the building, 2 older custodians, and myself and another 18-year-old. I was in the center courtyard of the school mowing the grass when I spotted someone at an upstairs window. It was an older woman. She looked like 65 maybe from the distance, with short curly hair, but her face was kind of blurred behind the glare of the window. I stopped mowing, looked at her, and waved. She didn't wave back. She didn't even move. I basically ran inside to where my boss was and asked who that woman upstairs was. He asked who. I told him to follow me. She was in one of the math classrooms. I led him to the upstairs math hallway. But to my surprise, all the classroom doors were closed and the lights were all off. The The classroom it looked like she was in was empty. My boss told me there was no one else in the building and that I need to drink some coffee. He went back downstairs, so I did the same. I was genuinely freaked out. After I finished mowing, I started mopping the upstairs hallways and classrooms. Eventually, I was in the math hallway, and I would be mopping every last classroom floor up there, so I opened all the doors and turned on all the lights. I had my radio on the floor playing music as usual. Over the music, I heard a distinct woman's voice. It said, "Young man." It came from one of the classrooms. I couldn't tell which, but I turned off the music and started checking every nearby classroom, desperately hoping to find someone. Every single classroom was empty. I even checked behind the desks. The hairs on my arms were standing up. I felt a fight or flight response kick in. I bailed to the downstairs and told my boss once again someone's up there. I heard a voice now. He once again went up there with me, and I explained that I couldn't find anyone, but I saw and now heard a woman up here. When we didn't find anyone again, he told me to go home and take the day off and get some sleep. He thought I was crazy. I then put the two incidents together. What if they were connected? What if what JJ and I saw in the woods and what I saw and heard in that classroom are somehow related? When I came back to work the next day, I told my boss I just didn't want to work in the math hallway because I was freaked out. For the rest of the summer, I didn't go in that hallway again. Ever since then, I full-heartedly believe that my old high school is haunted by some spirit of an older woman. I have no other explanations. This happened when I was 15, a sophomore in high school. Unfortunately, lunch classes were randomized, so this year I only had my friends Liam and Mike in that lunch period with me. A few months into the school year, one day this new kid walked in first period astronomy. Our teacher, who was a jokester, made him introduce himself to the class. His name was Craig. He teased Craig for a minute, then asked him to sit down. I sat in the back row, and the only open desk was next to me in the back corner. Craig came over and sat next to me. Class didn't technically start yet, so everyone was still chatting. As Craig sat down, he looked around the room, then I felt his stare shift to me. I turned and we made eye contact, and he nodded his head and said, "What's up?" I said, "Hey man, what's up?" He introduced himself, so I gave him my name as well. Craig was a white kid with very patchy, pubish-looking facial hair. He wasn't attractive, but he wasn't butt ugly. He just looked like a somewhat average guy. He was making small talk with me, and I was being nice because I could imagine how rough the first day at a new high school could be. I was probably the first person he officially met in the school. That period, we had to get into pairs for an assignment, so obviously Craig asked me to work with him. I had to say yes, why not? I didn't have any close friends in this class anyway. We had the laptop cart this period to begin work on the assignment, so we all had laptops. I could tell pretty quickly I didn't like Craig's sense of humor. He joked too much and was acting like we were good friends, but his jokes weren't normal, and he'd have this cringy laugh every time he made a joke. He cursed every other word, and he'd make constant dirty and vulgar jokes. I was no softy when it came to that, but it was just too much with him. By the end of the period, we had to exchange numbers for the project. Then it was on to my next class. Eventually came lunchtime. Mike didn't come to school for that day, so it was only Liam and I at our little circular lunch table. Suddenly I see Liam's eyes look up at someone behind me. Then someone pulls up a chair next to me, and I look and see Craig. He pats my shoulder and says, "What's up, buddy?" I kind of died a little inside. This meant he'd be sitting here every day now. I tried to be positive and give him a chance. Maybe he wasn't that bad. Liam tried being nice at first, but eventually, Craig started saying weird shit again, and Liam caught on that something was off, and he kept shooting me these knowing faces when Craig wasn't looking. That lunch period cemented the fact that something was off about Craig. I'm not judging anyone for being antisocial, but something about him seemed dark, like the awful things he'd say. It went beyond an antisocial personality. After school that day, since it was a Friday, I walked home and started texting my group chat about what we'd be doing later. On my walk home, I got a text from an unsaved number, and when I opened it, I realized it was Craig. He said, "Turn around." I did, and saw Craig running down the sidewalk towards me, waving. "Oh God," I said under my breath. I waited for him. When he caught up to me, he asked how far I lived from school. I said about a 10-minute walk, and he said same, and he said he'd walk with me. Then he asked if I wanted to work on the assignment real quick and bang it out over some beers. I told him I was actually going to be busy with my friends. He asked what I'd be doing. Uh-oh, he was trying to invite himself. I said we'd just be chilling at Liam's house, and he actually asked if it was cool he came. I didn't even know what to say. I came up with some BS, like Liam's mom doesn't let strangers in right away. It seemed to work. Craig kept walking with me, and I started wondering, is he following me all the way home? That's what he did. I got to my house and said, "Alright man, see you later," and gave him a little fist bump. He said, "See you later," and kept walking down the street. I noticed him look back, so I looked away. I texted my group chat about how weird he is, and Liam backed up what I was saying. We went about making plans to hang out at Liam's house for real, but not until like 9 o'clock. After an hour or two later, Craig texted me something disturbing. He said, "Yo, what's going on in front of your house? Why is there a cop car?" I replied, "What do you mean?" I rushed to go outside to the front stoop. There were no cop cars. It was just Craig standing in our driveway. He was laughing, and like a complete weirdo, he laughed and said, "I got you." Then he said, "I thought you were going to your friend Liam's place." I said, "Yeah, in a little bit." Then I said, "Why are you being weird?" He didn't laugh at that. I saw he was visibly offended. I said I gotta go inside, and so I did and shut the door. He texted me all offended saying, "Bro, WTF." I was speechless. I just met this kid today. I spent 40 minutes with him. Why was he obsessing over me and following me and now stalking me? He literally tricked me into coming outside to see if I was home. I texted him back, "You're freaking me out, bro." I guess that was a mistake. He sent me some long message about how he thought I seemed chill and was different from the rest, but how I'm just like everyone else. I sent a screenshot to my friend group, and they were all laughing and shocked at the same time. I emailed my teacher and asked him if I could do the assignment myself and explain the situation. Then I left my house and walked to Liam's house just to get out. While I was at Liam's, Craig tried calling me. I just let it ring and ignored it. It was going to be an awkward day of class come Monday morning. Skipping ahead to when I got home around 11 or 12, my parents and sister were out. My parents might have been out with friends, and my sister may have been with her boyfriend, nothing unusual. I locked the door behind me and went up to my room. I started watching YouTube videos, and I heard the back door ring. Yes, our house has a back doorbell. It had a different ring than the front doorbell. I hopped up and went downstairs, expecting to see my sister at the back door. But the lights in the backyard were off, and no one was on the other side of the door. I could see through the glass. I opened the main door, with the screen door still locked. I said hello, and I 100% heard the sound of someone's shoe scraping the concrete patio, just to the left, out of view from the door. I shut the door again and relocked it, and went back upstairs to call my dad, who didn't pick up. But just then, my phone started ringing again. It was Craig. I didn't pick up. He then texted me saying, "Come outside, shitbag." I replied, "I'm calling the police." And to my surprise, he replied, okay, I'm leaving." It was him. He was hiding in the yard, waiting for me to come out. I sent the screenshot to my family and friends, and then to the school, who would reach out to his parents. Apparently, this was the exact reason the troubled family had to keep moving, because he would keep causing issues with people at every school he went to. I can only imagine the horrible things he's done to other people who didn't want to be his friend. He didn't show up to class on Monday, or ever again. If I had to guess, I think he once again transferred schools. I live in rural New Brunswick. It was early September, and it was my first day of school. I unfortunately was held back my senior year, so I'd be returning as a 19-year-old. I live in a rural area, so the middle school and high school was the same building, which also meant I knew most of the kids since it was a smaller school. When I got to school, I had study hall period A, which was the first period of the day. However, I noticed a new kid that I never met before on the other side of the room. I walked over to him and introduced myself. He introduced himself to me as Chester, and that he just moved here. I showed him around the school and showed him where his next class is. As I was giving him a tour of the school, I noticed he seemed a bit off. As I was showing him around, he began to ask me questions. At first they seemed normal, like how long I've been at the school or where our classroom was, but then he asked me some questions that seemed more strange. One question he asked stood out the most. He asked for my address and snap. I was completely thrown off by this because I found it off to ask that. I ended up not giving him my address, but I thought why not to give him my snap. I gave him it and went on with my day. When the last period of the day came, I had English class. When I got to it, I noticed that there were only about 9 kids in the class. I was in the lowest level English class, so I wasn't expecting a lot of kids to be in my class. I took my seat, and that's when I looked 120 degrees behind me and saw that Chester kid eating a disgusting sandwich. He stared at me from the opposite side of the room and gestured for me to walk over to him. My English teacher, Mr. Bass, was about to start class, so I ignored his bullshit and went on with the class. 5 minutes later, I looked up from my book, and I noticed Chester again staring at me. This time he was more pissed off looking. Again, he gestured for me to walk over to him, and again, I continued reading my book. Then my phone pinged. It was a Snapchat message from Chester. He said, "Follow me." I replied, "I can't, we're in the middle of class." Next, I saw him get up from his table and ask Mr. Bass if he could go to the bathroom. He then walked out into the hall. I wanted to see why he wanted me to follow him, so 5 minutes later, I asked Mr. Bass if I could go to the bathroom as well. I then walked out into the hall. I didn't know where he went, so I looked down each hallway, and eventually I saw him. He was walking really slowly about 50 feet away. I stayed at a distance behind him so that he wouldn't know I was there. He then turned down a hallway in the school that wasn't really used for classes, and was more for storage, bathrooms, and offices. I then saw him open a door. He walked inside and shut the door behind him. I walked over to the door he walked in and recognized it to be the door that led to the school's basement. There was no way in hell I was going down there. I just casually went back to my class. When I got back, my phone pinged. It was him again. First, he sent me a message saying, "Why didn't you enter the basement?" He then sent a picture of him eating a disgusting sandwich in the basement. He sent one more chat asking me to walk down into the basement. By now, I was getting creeped out by the kid, so I replied asking him to leave me alone. I then removed and blocked him. When I got home, I immediately started on my homework. By the time I was done, it was about 11 p.m., and I was home alone. I was putting all of my homework away. Just then, my phone received a notification from Snapchat. Someone added me as a friend. It was from an account called "Why Didn't You Enter the Basement?" It was him, so I blocked it. Then a couple minutes later, I got another request. This time the account was called "Why'd You Block Me?" I blocked that one, and then another one came. This one was even more ominous. It was called "I Know Where You Live," followed by "I'm right outside your house." And just then, I heard a window break downstairs. I immediately called the cops and told them what was happening, and the operator said find a safe place to hide and lock the door. I then hung up and went into the hallway closet. I heard footsteps move from downstairs to upstairs. I cracked open the closet door and I saw him. At the end of the hallway in the dark, I saw Chester. It didn't seem like he knew that I noticed him until he turned his head to look at the closet, but it didn't seem like he knew I was inside. I didn't close the door, but I hid deeper in the closet. Chester then went over and opened the door. I was hiding behind a large container while he struggled to find the light. He eventually gave up and I heard his footsteps fade away downstairs. Seconds later, the police knocked on the door. I immediately opened it and told them what happened, but by the time they arrived, Chester was gone, and there was nobody on my property. They found out that he escaped through a window in my basement. I gave the police the accounts, and they said they'll do their best to trace them. The very next day of school, I went to the principal to report Chester, but the creepiest thing was what he told me. My principal said that there was nobody in the whole school named Chester. There were no records of him ever having been a student. I got chills. The camera footage was checked, and it turned out that he snuck in through a back entrance of the school and blended in with the other kids. I never saw him again at school, and I never heard from the police. But to this day, I still think about why he wanted me to go into the school basement. All I can say is that was probably the most dangerous person I'd ever met, and I don't know what his intentions were. A surprising amount of people have Ouija boards just sitting in their closets somewhere collecting dust, and most people probably have never even used them. I found out what Ouija boards are when I was 16, and when I asked my parents if we had one in our house, my mom told me yes, she did have one buried somewhere in the closet with all the board games. That closet was in the basement by the laundry room, the small closet with a bunch of my parents' old stuff. I was intrigued to try using a Ouija board because I was slightly superstitious. I had my mom help me dig through this closet without disrupting the integrity and neatness of how she sorted everything in there. And lo and behold, eventually she finds this old dusty box that simply said Ouija and had two hands holding the piece that moves around the board called the planchette. The box was kind of falling apart on the edges, even though my mom said they'd only used it a couple times ever. The first thing I did was text a few of my friends to come use the Ouija board with me that weekend when I'd be home alone, to make it scarier. My friend Liam, who was 17, had a car, so he picked up my friend Jack and they came right over. It was like 9 p.m. It was dark out, obviously, and my parents were gone for a couple nights. My younger brother of 2 years, Adam, was also home, so I asked him to join as well. We were going to play on the floor in the loft, which was converted into my bedroom. We turned off the lights and then turned on a flashlight and put it on the floor in the corner of the room, pointed towards the board. All four of us sat on one side of the board and we held the planchette and started asking questions. None of us had ever done this before, so we asked basic questions. I said, if there's someone there, move the planchette. Then, for the first time, it started to move to the word yes. Adam asked, how old are you? And the planchette moved from the number 6 to 7, 67. We looked at each other, and while I suspected one of them were moving it, and I'm sure the others did too, we all played along and didn't break immersion. We took turns asking questions. Eventually, I asked the board, are you a demon? And the planchette went to the word yes. At this point, we all laughed and broke immersion, knowing one of us was messing around. At that moment, the flashlight turned off, and all of us stopped laughing and got really scared. Who did that? Someone asked. But it was clearly none of us. The flashlight was all the way in the corner. I crawled to get it and kept pressing the button. It wouldn't turn back on. I turned on my bedside lamp, and I saw the freaked out expressions on my friend's and brother's face. I said that was the most terrifying moment for the battery to die, but also part of me believed it wasn't a coincidence. We stopped playing after that moment, and we even left my room and went to the backyard just because we were all freaked out being in the house at that moment. I had to sleep in that room that night though, and when my friends left and Adam eventually went to sleep, I knew I had to as well. I put the Ouija board back in the box and brought it downstairs out of my room. I just felt weird sleeping in the same room as it that night. As soon as I turned off the light, I just tried to go to sleep right away, not sitting on my phone for an hour or whatever, like I usually do. As I was starting to finally drift off into a half-sleep state, something in my closet fell over. I immediately rose up and looked in the direction of the closet door. I flicked on the bedside lamp and walked over to the closet. It was a small walk-in closet where I kept some of my clothes. There's a light switch on the outside of the closet that turned on a single light bulb inside of it. I flicked it on and looked down at the crack at the bottom of the door. There were what looked to be 2 shadows cast by feet on the other side of the door. As soon as I saw this, I started screaming at him and ran to his room. I explained to him what I just saw and led him to my room to show him. When he came to my room, the light in the closet was still on, but the shadows at the bottom of the door weren't there anymore. I opened the door, and there was nobody in the closet, but there was something on the floor. It was a wooden box that I made in arts and crafts that I would put childhood memorabilia in. It somehow fell over and the contents spilled onto the floor. There is no draft in the world that would have knocked that over. It made no logical sense. I slept in my parents' bed that night and then the next, and for a week after that I slept in the spare bedroom. Eventually I would start sleeping in my own bed again, but I would never forget that night. I haven't touched a Ouija board since. I had never used a Ouija board until I was in my mid-20s. It was never something that interested me, but my friend George was very briefly talking to this girl who was into that sort of thing. Her name was Mandy. She was into exploring abandoned and allegedly haunted places. One day he invited me to go with them and her friend to this apparently haunted abandoned house about a half-hour drive away. He guaranteed me the friend was cute in order to entice me to go. I didn't have anything going on that night, so I said, why not? We would be doing this late at night. George picked me up first around 11 p.m., and then we drove to pick up the girls from this park. I had already met Mandy once, but not her friend. Her friend Carly had red hair, a nose ring, and sleeve on her right arm. Mandy had already been to this house before, and she said it was high in activity, a term I'd never heard till that point, but obviously could put together what she meant. I smiled a bit as she said it because I honestly laughed to myself. I don't believe in the paranormal myself, so I found it a little humorous. Mandy brought this big bag with her, so during the drive I asked what's inside. And then she goes and pulls out this box, a Ouija board box, and then she pulls out a candle. Then George said, "Oh, that's the surprise." Apparently her surprise to George was that we would be using a Ouija board in this abandoned house. I'm gonna be honest, that didn't sound super fun to me, but I was there for the adventure. Mandy directed George where to park when we got close. It was this really dark street with no streetlights, with an open field on one side and trees on the other. The house driveway was gated off, so we had to walk from there. We walked through some woods that led us to the backyard of the house. From there, Mandy led us to the back window that she climbed through last time. It was a bit high up, so we had to help the girls up. Then we just climbed in ourselves, and we walked around the house for a bit. All the furniture was still inside, but it was just decrepit. It hadn't been lived in for probably decades. I don't scare easily, and I must admit, being in there at night was very eerie. It would probably be terrifying alone. It was dead silent besides our footsteps on the creaky floors. There were some old portraits of people hung on the wall. They looked like they were taken in the 50s, which made me wonder how old this house was and what was the story behind it. Most likely the couple living there died and there was no family left to claim the house. Mandy set up the board on the floor and she lit these 2 candles. I could tell she was really into this stuff. She took lead with this, asking a bunch of spiritual questions. The planchette piece didn't move for the first few questions as she kept asking, "Is anyone there? Can anyone hear?" etc. Eventually, it started to spell out the word hello. I laughed and looked at George, who laughed back, but the girls were serious and even said stop laughing. Out of respect, I did stop smiling and put a serious face on. Mandy asked, "What's your name?" and the planchette moved around the board slowly to spell out the name Gregory. She then asked, "How long have you been dead?" and then it moved around to spell out 30 years. I didn't believe any of this for a second. I knew Mandy or Carly were doing this. This went on for some time, and we played along, until there was a huge thump from upstairs in the house. We all jumped and let go of the planchette. George said, "Is someone up there?" and Mandy insisted it could be Gregory. Mandy and Carly put their hands back on the planchette and asked, "Gregory, did you make that sound?" And George and I stopped her and said we need to leave if someone's upstairs. Then we watched as the planchette moved to the word yes. At this point, George and I were convinced the girls were pranking us, and that they had someone upstairs trying to scare us. Then we heard footsteps above us. There was no denying these sounds were footsteps. George and I agreed to go upstairs and check it out, expecting to find someone trying to prank us. The girls kept saying, "No, come back down." We went up the extremely creaky steps and entered the first open door we found. It was a bedroom. The furniture and everything in the room was extremely decayed, and then there was this door right in the corner of the room, most likely a closet. It was cracked open, and we whispered to each other that we thought we heard something in the closet. I put my finger up to my lips to tell him to be quiet, and we listened. When we heard a clear exhale behind the door, we both quickly left the room. We hurried downstairs, expecting to find the girls still in the living room, but they were gone. The candles, the Ouija board, everything. There was just darkness in the house now. We didn't even hear them sneak out. We left through the window again in a hurry and ran to the car. George tried calling Mandy's phone multiple times, but it went straight to voicemail every time. She blocked him. They were nowhere to be found either. We went straight to the car and drove home. George never heard from that girl again. He only hung out with her 2 times. He didn't know where she lived or anything. We did form our own crazy theory that they were in fact trying to trap us somehow, and the footsteps upstairs were from somebody they knew. It's also possible they never left the house, and that they were hiding somewhere inside. The more superstitious out there may believe that we did in fact speak to a spirit though, and something more supernatural was going on. In October of 2015, when I was a junior in high school, I was in my horror phase where I was obsessed with everything scary and supernatural. With Halloween coming up, I was also reading a lot of scary stories about Ouija boards and people's experiences with them. My curiosity was piqued, and so I ordered a Ouija board off Amazon, and when it arrived, I waited till a night our parents were not home to use it. I convinced my little sister to try it with me. We were at the dining room table with the lights dimmed, both of us holding the planchette. I asked the board some questions, and my sister and I both laughed because it was kind of awkward and funny. I started to move the piece around, trying to creep out my sister, but she knew it was me doing it. After a few minutes of doing this, we were starting to get bored, and my sister wanted to stop. I said let's try for a few more minutes. After a little bit more waiting for the planchette to move from some unseen entity, we decided to give up. My sister went to her room after this, and I went to mine. I looked up more Ouija board stories online and kept reading people's experiences with them, and then I looked up why it didn't work for us. Other people had said their first time using Ouija boards nothing had happened, so I decided I would try again. That night around 1 a.m., when my sister was already asleep, I went back down to the dining room and dimmed the lights again. I once again tried to use the Ouija board, asking similar questions as a few hours ago, just in a lower voice to not wake up my sister. I held the planchette with both hands, waiting for it to move, but it never did. Instead, I heard sounds from upstairs, like soft footsteps. It could have been my sister. She might have heard me down here. The footstep-type sounds were followed by a muffled female voice. It didn't sound quite like my sister, though, and the voice was coming from directly above me. The room above the dining room was our older brother's room, who was away at college. My sister wouldn't have been in there. I went up the stairs quietly, and I heard the voice getting louder as I got closer to my brother's room. It was coming from in there. I was curious if my sister was playing a prank on me, changing her voice to sound lower to scare me. I got to the door and put my ear up against it. I heard the voice of what sounded like an older woman. I wasn't sure how my sister could be doing a voice like that. At first I didn't know what was being said, until I realized that the voice kept saying, "Grandma's here, Georgie," over and over. It was the voice of my dead grandma. I felt every hair in my body stand up. I opened the door and turned on the light, and no one was inside. The voice had stopped. I ran to my room and shut the door and locked it and curled up under the covers. I felt the whole room spinning as I couldn't form any rational thoughts of what just happened. It was too vivid to have imagined it. When I calmed down, I did a prayer before going to sleep. Or at least trying to go to sleep. I was awake all night. I still remember this night just as vividly 8 years later. It was senior year. I had just recently started dating my fiancé Mark. We were approaching the end of the school year, and so prom was coming up. I didn't really know if I wanted to go, because I had just finally changed all of my contact info, and my family moved to a new house because of my old stalker ex Daryl, who's 4 years older than me. I was 18 and he was 22. We met when I was going through a rough time in my life. Long story, but he turned out to be a psychotic asshole. He got kicked out of the army and started doing hard drugs like heroin. I distanced myself from him as much as I could, but he was relentless. He attempted to break into my family's home at least 3 times, and I had to get a restraining order against him. But my family was worried for me, and for all of us, so we had to move to another house. The reason I was hesitant about going to prom was because I knew my ex Daryl knew about it. We used to talk about going to my prom together. Ever since our move, my friends would drive me home and make sure we weren't followed. I really lived in fear. I was scared Daryl would show up to the prom venue and try to find me. Mark has always been very understanding and supportive, and he assured me he wouldn't tell me to go to prom if he didn't think it would be safe. He made me feel comfortable with it. We and our friends went in a limousine together to the venue, which was a fancy catering hall about 30 minutes away. We all sat at our table and had food and just hung out for a while. Some people went to dance, Mark and I included, for a while. I couldn't help but be paranoid for a while that Daryl was in the building somehow. One of Mark's friends handed me a little shot bottle of vodka and told me it would calm my nerves. I drank it in the bathroom and almost threw up, but within half an hour it really did take the edge off. A few hours later, our group wanted to leave for what's called the after prom, where you basically start drinking and continuing the party elsewhere with your friends. As we walked outside of the venue to our respective rides, I saw one car parked in front of the venue that didn't have its lights on. I didn't know what Daryl drove at that point, or if he drove, but I saw someone sitting in it. They had a baseball hat on and were looking down, so I couldn't see their face. I pointed it out to Mark. He told me to relax, there's no way it's him. We got in our friend's car who was picking us up, and we drove to our friend Melissa's house, who was having a little after party. The whole ride, I kept looking behind us, seeing if we were being followed, but I couldn't tell because there were so many cars on the road. I remember Mark whispering to me, "Relax, everything's fine," and he held my hand, and it helped calm me down so much. We arrived to Melissa's house, and there were already people at her house. At the peak of the night, I'd say there were 20 people there, and everyone was drinking. Eventually, Mark and I wanted to go home, so Mark called his sister to come pick us up, and when she got there, we went straight out to her car. I looked around the street for any sketchy-looking cars, but didn't see anything, and at this point, I officially convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Mark's sister drove us back to their house where I would be sleeping over. It was just his mom and his sister home. His dad is a retired cop, but he was still working at the time, and he was working a late shift that night. His mom was already asleep. It was very late. Mark and I just went downstairs to his room to crawl into bed. The whole den floor of the house was his floor. It had a mini kitchen, bedroom, and living room. His floor was level with the backyard, and so it had a back door. It was a warm night, so some of the windows were cracked open. We were watching a funny movie. That was when we heard a bang on the glass door that led to the backyard. The sliding curtain was covering the door, so we couldn't see who or what did it. I shrieked, and Mark jumped up to open the curtain. No one was on the other side, but there was a post-it note slapped on the door with the word "bitch" on it. He found me. He followed me from the prom to Melissa's house to here, and he probably heard me laughing and knew I was down here. My paranoia was right all along. We went upstairs to Mark's mom's room and woke her up, then called Mark's dad and the police. Waiting for Mark's dad and the rest of the police to arrive felt like an actual eternity. When the doorbell finally rang, followed by loud knocks, Mark and his mom went to go answer the door. It was the police. I had to explain the whole story with my ex, and the restraining order, and now being followed by him here. They asked if there were any cameras on the property, to which Mark's mom said no. Then they asked me if I had any texts from him, or if perhaps I knew where he lived. I told them I didn't have his number anymore, and I had no idea where he lived anymore either. Mark's dad finally arrived on the scene. I took the post-it note from the door home with me to try and compare it to other handwriting from Daryl, and it definitely matched. Mark's dad gave me a ride to my house in his police car so that we could be sure I wouldn't be followed. During the ride home, I called our home phone and my dad picked up. I cried to him into the phone hysterically. After arriving home, my parents were waiting in the front for me. Mark's dad assured my parents we weren't followed. During this period, Mark and I couldn't go to each other's houses. Mark's parents had security cameras installed the same week, and this next part is truly unbelievable. One of the side cameras on their property picked up motion, which alerted Mark's dad's phone. He grabbed his gun and ran outside to the smell of gasoline. He followed the smell until he heard the sound of liquid being poured out of a can, and there he saw Daryl pouring out gasoline on the sides of their house. With his gun drawn, Mark's dad yelled at him to drop the can and put his hands up, and that was the moment Daryl was no longer going to be a threat to my or my loved ones' lives. I call it the sweetest justice that my future fiance's cop dad was the one to arrest my psychotic ex-boyfriend who ruined so many years of my life and had me living in worry. He was sentenced to over 30 years for his crimes, the worst of which, of course, was attempted arson on a police officer's house. It was 2017. I was 17 getting ready for prom. And of course, girls have it harder because instead of the guys who just rent the same tuxedos, girls have to find a nice dress that they're going to keep. And of course, prom dresses aren't cheap, if you want a nice one at least. My parents didn't want to spend over $200 for a prom dress, so my mom suggested I look online for a used one. She'd even help me. We scrolled on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace, which had just become a thing back then and wasn't as popular as it is today. There wasn't really any luck on Facebook Marketplace, so we mainly searched Craigslist. We found a listing for a dress that we both liked. It was a navy blue evening gown, $50. It said it was worn once for prom. The seller lived pretty close too, so I contacted the number listed on the listing, and in under 10 minutes I got a text back. After expressing my interest and asking a couple sizing questions, the person offered to come to our house to drop it off to us, but my mom said no to having someone from Craigslist come to our house, so I said we'd come to them that day. I asked for their name and they said Alex. Honestly, I assumed that Alex was short for Alexandra. My mom offered to come with me. I felt more comfortable if she'd drive me. When we got to the address, it was a townhouse in a congested area of town. The townhouse was on a dead end. My mom asked if I wanted her to come in with me, and honestly, I don't know why, but I thought it would be embarrassing to go in with my mom. I asked her to just wait in the car unless I text her. I texted Alex, and then I went to ring the doorbell. I noticed all the blinds on the windows were closed, which was strange. It was the middle of the day. The door opened, and instead of some young girl around my age opening the door, it was an actual grown man, like 50 years old. He smiled and asked if I was here for the dress. I said, "Yeah, are you Alex?" And he said, "Yeah." He said I looked just like his daughter, and then said, "Come inside." I looked back at my mom's car and then went inside the house. He said I should be a perfect fit for the dress. He said he'd go get it, then disappeared into another room. The living room was dark and kind of messy. I took out my phone and texted my mom to come to the front door. Then the man called out from a room for me to come inside and try the dress on in front of a mirror. I asked him if he could bring the dress out to the living room. He said there's no mirror in the living room, and I replied that I'd just like to see the dress first. He left the room and entered the living room empty-handed, and said the dress is on the bed in the bedroom if I want to go look at it. I once again asked him to please just bring it out here. Then a knock at the front door. Alex said, "Who is that?" And I opened the door to my mom stepping inside. She smiled and said hello to the man, and he took a couple seconds to say hello back, but without a smile. Now I walked to the doorway of the bedroom, and as I did, he made a noise as if to say, "Don't go in there." I looked into the dark bedroom, and there was no dress on the bed. My mom was in the middle of asking a question when I interrupted and said, "There's no dress." There was a painfully uncomfortable and tense silence, and then the man said, "I'd like you to leave now." My mom and I, without hesitation, left to the car. By the time we were in the car, the front door was already closed, and I saw the man peering through the kinked blinds. We were both in shock. If my mom hadn't come in, I don't know what would have happened. I reported the Craigslist ad. We didn't call the police though, because there was really no proof of anything, and technically nothing happened. But there was no blue dress in that room. He was just trying to get me into that room, and when my mom came in, he couldn't exactly do that anymore. Thank God I listened to my mom and didn't give him our address. I ended up getting a used dress shipped to me. That prom night, I told everyone this story, and it's still kind of haunting even today. In our high school class, there was a kid named Joshua that moved to our high school during freshman year, so I guess he had a hard time breaking into any of the established friend groups. He had a few friends here and there from what I know, but he wasn't part of any particular groups. But then something really awkward happened one day during lunch. I had already asked my date Natalie to prom, and she said yes. At lunch, we had a table of mixed guys and girls, and Natalie was at the table. Here came Joshua from whatever table he was sitting at, and like an awkward scene out of a movie, he tapped Natalie on the shoulder and asked her to prom. The whole table went silent except for one kid who cheered sarcastically. Then Natalie laughed in clear discomfort and said she's already going with me. I felt the secondhand embarrassment. Joshua looked at me, and I didn't know what to think of the stare he gave me, but I could tell he was humiliated. He left without saying a word, and everyone laughed loudly. It was a horribly uncomfortable scenario all around. While I felt bad, I couldn't help but slightly laugh too. I mean, I have no idea what he thought was going to happen, especially with such a large audience of dudes at the table too. We watched as Joshua actually left the cafeteria, and the teacher on lunch duty actually chased after him because you weren't allowed to leave without a pass. But Joshua never came back into the lunchroom. I still wonder where he went from there. On prom night, we had our group of 10 in the back of the limo. The same 10 of us sat at the table together when at the dance. Everything was going as prom should. But then, eventually that night, one of my friends told me, "Don't look now, but Joshua's at that table eyeballing you." I waited like 10 seconds before looking over, and I saw Joshua shooting a dagger at, I guess, Natalie and I. I decided I'd go talk to him, but as I walked over to him, he got up and hurried away out of the dance hall. That was super weird, but I wasn't going to chase after him. I went over to the table he was sitting at and asked a couple of the kids if they came with Joshua, and they said no, he kinda just sat there randomly and wasn't saying anything. I went back to my table, and like a typical high schooler, I told the whole table. It was definitely pretty freakish. After prom, Natalie and I left with a friend who drove to go to a diner to eat a bunch of breakfast food at like 12 a.m. After that, we went to our friend Anthony's house. He had a massive backyard right next to a nature preserve, and he had a really cool fire pit. So we all circled the fire pit with a speaker playing music and some drinks. There were 6 of us total. Anthony, sitting across from me, pointed out to the woods and said he saw something in the woods. We all looked over, of course. We looked at the woods for a while, but when we didn't see anything, Anthony basically said, "Aight, whatever." We continued to hang by the fire pit for a while. Eventually one couple left, so it was just Natalie, Anthony, his date, and myself left. Anthony was mid-sentence when he stopped speaking abruptly. I said, "What?" and I turned around and saw someone walking towards the light of the fire from the woods. It was someone in a tuxedo. He said to us, "Don't get up." As he got closer, we realized it was Joshua. He was holding a hatchet or small axe. He looked like he had been crying, but he also looked angry. Anthony and I told him to please put the axe down and just talk. Joshua yelled at us to shut up, and he made us turn the music off. He began a rant about how soul-crushingly embarrassing what happened during lunch that day was, and how he had been too embarrassed to come back to school after that because he thought it had been spread all over the school, but it really hadn't, and we tried to tell him that. Anytime we tried to speak, he'd scream "shut the fuck up" louder and louder, and he'd begin to raise the axe kind of. He then directed his attention to Natalie and started going on about how he thought she was gorgeous, and that she would only make fun of him with her friends, which again, that never happened. All these things only happened in his head. During this time that he was talking to Natalie, Anthony was low-key and texted his dad something like "bring the gun to the backyard," making it clear we were in danger. Anthony's dad came out to the back door and yelled, "What's going on?" with his gun in his hand. Joshua stopped talking, and I could see he was deciding in his head whether to run or not. He dropped the axe and ran back to the woods. Anthony's dad came running over with his gun, and we all 4 of us couldn't tell him what happened quick enough. His dad said not to touch the axe, leave the fingerprints on it for the police. That hatchet, axe, whatever, was eventually the key to prosecuting Joshua after a few days. Joshua had already been arrested, and so his fingerprints were in the system, and they matched the fingerprints on the axe. But when all 4 of us decided we didn't want to press charges on Joshua, it was too late. By that point, he got charged criminally. Anthony's friend said it was for menacing in the 2nd degree. He didn't serve any jail time. I found Joshua on Facebook shortly after this and reached out to him with a sincere message not attacking him at all, and he read it. He never replied to it. I saw Joshua one other time in the halls that year. He didn't look at me. None of us ever saw him again after graduation. Years ago, I did the night shift at a gas station because I was strapped for cash and needed a second job. I worked the night shift there for a few months. It was around my 2nd or 3rd month that this guy started regularly coming in really late at night, always around 2 a.m. He was about 6 feet tall, He had long, stringy hair. He'd always come in, buy a tall boy, and leave. But after a while, he one night asked me my name. I told him my name, and he just kept saying, "Rob, I like that," as he'd laugh to himself. He cracked open the tall boy he just bought and walked out of the store talking to himself. He was clearly hammered. This was the night I was curious to see if he had been drinking and driving every single time that he'd come to the store. I watched as he left, and he walked out of sight off the gas station property. That would make sense. He never once bought gas anytime he came in. He'd always just buy alcohol. I'd seen him just about every night after that for a while. He'd come in, some nights noticeably drunker than others, and sometimes he'd just lean on one of the shelves for a while and not say anything. He'd always greet me with a "Hey Rob" anytime he'd come in. One night he was just leaning on a shelf, drinking the tall boy he just bought, not saying anything, just staring at a wall. I asked him for his name finally. He looked at me, took about 5 seconds, and said, "Bob." Now, I always felt like Bob is a go-to fake name when you're lying about your name. I wondered if the first thing that came to mind for him was Bob because it rhymes with my name, but I went with it. I said, "So Bob, where do you work?" He laughed so loud it actually startled me. He said he doesn't work. He said the government completely fucked him out of his job. I got the vibe he was wasted again. He looked at me with an angry-looking face, but interestingly said, "I like you, Rob. You seem like you know what you're doing." I didn't know what that meant, but he walked out of the store right after that. I didn't see him again for a while. I'd say over a week passed, which for a regular like him was a while. Bob always gave me this off, mildly creepy vibe. I figured he was usually drunk, but something was obviously wrong in his personal life. Well, one very stormy night, with less customers than usual, likely because of the storm, I heard the ding of the front door as someone entered, and I swear before looking I imagined it to be Bob, and when I looked, I was shocked to see it was actually him. But it was a much scarier version of Bob. He was completely soaked. He wasn't wearing a rain jacket or using an umbrella. He was just in a dark shirt and jeans. His long hair was drenched, and he was just standing by the door looking straight ahead at the wall. He looked like he was angry, and yet his mind was elsewhere, like his thoughts were running. The way he was standing there blankly, staring at nothing, completely soaked, it was freaking me out. I said, "Bob, are you okay?" He didn't turn his head or move. He stood still and said, "I did something really bad." I asked, "What did you do?" He then looked at me, said, "I need somewhere to hide," then walked past me at the register towards the little restroom hallway. He disappeared behind the wall, and I heard one of the doors open and close. I was genuinely getting uncomfortable with Bob now. I didn't enjoy his presence whenever he was in the store, and tonight something was extra off about him. He seemed like a zombie, and that "I did something really bad" comment was incredibly creepy. Some time passed, and Bob never came out from the bathroom. I assumed he was wasted again, probably passed out or puking. Either way, I didn't want to intervene. And then, the next thing I remember, the lights to the place cut out, and the store was completely dark. I was standing in a pitch-dark gas station during a major storm with an unhinged drunk man. I used the flashlight from behind the counter to make my way towards the back of the store by the inventory storage and the panel board. The door to the back was in the same little hallway as the restrooms. As I walked by the 2 restroom doors, both of them were ajar, and Bob wasn't in either of them. I went through the door to the back. I was planning on going straight to the panel board, but I stopped when I heard a slight dripping in the room somewhere, and the squeaking of wet shoes. My heart sank into my stomach. I said, "Bob," in a very weak and scared voice. I heard squeaks right to my left. When I pointed my flashlight in that corner, there was Bob, with his eyes opened wide, and he lunged at me and started screaming, "I'm gonna fucking kill you." I pushed him off of me as he was clawing at my back. I ran back through the door to the front of the store. He didn't follow me. I grabbed my rain jacket and ran straight to my car. I sat in my car as I dialed 911 and spoke to an operator. I stayed on the line with her, and it didn't take long for a couple police officers to arrive and go inside with me. Bob was still hiding in the back room, huddled in a corner, apparently like some rabid creature. His pupils were huge. I only noticed it then. He was on something. They took him to the station after I told them that he lunged at me, threatened to kill me, and stated that he did something really bad earlier. I found out over a month later that this Bob guy's real name was Martin. He had brutally beaten his ex-wife to death. It might have happened on that same night that he came into the gas station. Long story short, I never wanted to work another night shift at any job ever again after this night. I've done a lot of night driving in my life. Not for work or anything. My old friend group and I would always just stay out till crazy hours when we were in our late teens and early 20s. I guess you could say we were the losers. We thought staying out till 5 a.m. every weekend hanging at parks or in parking lots was cool. Looking back, it was a stupid waste of time. But basically for that reason, I've done my fair share of driving at off hours in the night. And usually that's when the drunkos and crazy people are on the roads. It was a weekend night. It had to be approaching 4 in the morning. I wanted to go home. I drove one of my friends home from the park we were hanging out at, and before driving myself home, I had to stop for gas. I used to like getting gas at night because there would be no other cars in the way. I pulled into one of my usual gas stations not far from my parents' house. As I was walking to the building to pay, there was a short guy wearing a hood walking past me. He stopped in his tracks and stared me down as I walked past. I said, "What?" as I kept walking. He said nothing, so I kept walking. Typical crackhead. I went inside the building to pay the attendant for my gas. I also bought a lottery ticket while I was there. I came back outside and started to fill up. I looked around, and as expected, it was a ghost town at this hour. Once done, I got back in the car and started driving home. Halfway home, I heard something behind me, in the car. I looked in the rearview mirror, and there was someone in the rear seat looking back at me. I let out a scream so loud I probably almost collapsed my lungs. I slammed on the brakes and screamed, "Get out!" It was the dude from the gas station. I opened my doors and started screaming help, knowing at least a couple people would come out from their houses. Sure enough, a couple houses' porch lights turned on, and I saw some doors opening. The guy got out of my car and said I could have slit your throat. As some people came out of their houses, he started to run away down the street. I didn't chase after him. A couple people came over to me and asked if I was alright, and I told them how a stranger was in my back seat. By now, the guy was out of sight. I wasn't about to start driving around after a crackhead. I thanked the people who came out and continued my drive home, making sure I didn't see him anywhere the rest of the drive. That was the scariest experience of my life. This event happened in the mid-60s in the Atlanta area. At that time, I was about 8 or 9 years old. My father taught school in a suburb of Atlanta that was some distance from where our home was located. I went to the same school where he taught, so I rode with him every day. However, we had to get up very early each morning and head out before the sun was up. We always stopped several mornings each week to top off on gas at a small, independent station. We were often the first car there shortly after the station opened. In those days, everything was full service. There was a booth with an attendant who would come out and fill your tank, wash your windows, etc. He would always be carrying a wad of bills in his pocket and a device on his belt from which he counted out coins. Behind the pumps were tiny bathrooms. I would often use the bathroom on mornings that we stopped there, as it was a fairly long drive. One morning, we again arrived before dawn to find the station completely deserted. It was totally quiet other than the traffic sounds going by. There was no sign of an attendant, either in the booth or anywhere else around the station. My father blew the car horn once, then again a few more times, but there was no response. We discussed what might be the problem. My father first suggested that perhaps the attendant might be in the bathroom, but when he still did not appear, my father said that maybe the attendant had experienced car trouble and had not been able to make it to work on time. We continued to wait for several minutes. No other cars pulled in. I told my father I needed to use the bathroom and put my hand on the car door handle to get out, but he told me that we could not wait any longer and I could use the bathroom at the next station we came to. So we left, still wondering what happened. A day or two later, my father was reading the local newspaper when I heard a loud exclamation from him. He excitedly told my mother and I about a small article which stated that the body of a gas station attendant had been discovered with multiple stabs stuffed into the men's bathroom of the station. It was the station we always went to. The article said the motive appeared to be robbery, as all cash and coins were missing. Early in the morning, the total amount of money was probably not a lot. The article gave no hint as to what amount was taken, but either way, that didn't stop the killer. I've often wondered how I would have been affected at that young age if I had insisted on going to the bathroom at that station and had opened the door to discover the body of the murdered attendant. We never went to that gas station again. This took place when I was 25. I was driving from North to South Texas, and due to my work schedule, I could only do this late at night. I was on Route 281 for much of the drive, and at these late hours, it was an easy, straight drive. I just had to keep myself awake. I was already kind of shot from work, and then getting on the road right after was brutal. I had to keep making stops for coffee at random gas stations just to keep myself going. I think it was my third time starting to feel a little sleepy, and on top of that, I needed to fill up my tank as well. I pulled into the first gas station I could find on the desolate side roads. I can't remember what kind of gas station it was, maybe a Sunoco or Shell. There was one other car in the parking lot. I parked next to one of the pumps and went inside. There were two people in the shop, the cashier, and then I noticed another guy pacing down the aisles. I went to the coffee maker and poured myself a cup. The guy who was pacing around came up to me and said, "Careful, it's hot," and then he laughed. It was a piss-poor, creepy, unnecessary attempt at starting a conversation that I didn't bite at. I was not in the mood. I didn't reply, and I took the coffee to the cashier where I paid for it as well as for the gas. The guy came up behind me while I was paying and said, "I really like that top." I said thank you just loud enough for him to hear. He followed it up with, "Where are you heading off to so late at night?" I was so annoyed by this point, I firmly asked him to leave me alone. The cashier was some 40-something-year-old Hispanic man. I wasn't sure how much English he understood, or if he was even reading the situation that was happening in front of him, but he was also a smaller, shorter man, and it was doubtful he was going to step in at all. The man behind me said calm down after I asked him to leave me alone. I left the shop without saying another word and went to my car. I heard the door open again a few seconds after I left the shop. I was next to my car now, preparing to fill up the tank. As gas started pumping into my car, I heard his footsteps on the concrete over on the other side of the pumps. Then they stopped. When the footsteps stopped, I glanced over, and I noticed him, creepily standing on the other side of the pump I was using. He was quite literally just standing there watching me. He wasn't filling up gas. There wasn't even a car there. I started considering grabbing my pepper spray from my center console. The guy said, "Are you alone?" When he asked that, the gravity of the situation escalated greatly. I replied, "No, my boyfriend is in the car." I opened the door and quickly grabbed the pepper spray from the center console. I grabbed it and held it at my side, pretending to still be focused on pumping the gas. The man was inching his way around the gas pump, like he was coming around to my side. He said, "I don't see anyone in the car." I pulled out the pepper spray and aimed it up at the man, and he laughed and backed away. He said he was just trying to make conversation. He was walking backwards with his focus locked onto me still. I was just about done pumping gas. Then I felt and heard a clank. The gas stopped pumping. My tank was full. I had like $6 worth of change. I had to go back inside to get it. The man was in between the shop and I. I had to make a choice. I made the decision to get my change. I had my arm up in the air still, pointing the pepper spray can at him. He continued to back away, chuckling. When it was safe, I turned my back to him and entered the shop and asked the cashier for change. I told the cashier that that man was making me really uncomfortable, but it seemed like he didn't really understand what I was saying. Once I got my change, I looked out the glass door into the parking lot before leaving. I didn't see that man out there. I was scared to go out there. Like, what if he were hiding somewhere? I stepped outside in front of the shop. I didn't leave that little sidewalk. I just stayed there, looking around. That man was gone, out of sight, which meant he was absolutely hiding. Eventually, a pickup truck pulled into the parking lot and pulled next to one of the pumps. A large man with a beard stepped out, and I went over to him asking him for help. I asked him to check if there was a man hiding behind my car. He was confused, but he did it for me. He got to the other side of my car, and he yelled, "What are you doing?" And there went that creepy man, hurrying away from behind my car. He started to run away into the darkness surrounding the gas station. I thanked that man so much, and he said in his thick southern accent to be careful out there. I left that parking lot in a hurry, and I continued the rest of my drive. That creepy man was 100% waiting to pounce as soon as I unlocked my car doors, and that's really disturbing to me. I'm a police officer in South Jersey. I've been doing this since I was 23. For the most part, it's not as exciting as it's cracked up to be. Not a whole lot happens in my county. Usually the worst calls are disturbance calls or an occasional shoplifting, with something a little more serious sprinkled in there once in a blue moon. I've done just about every possible shift there is. I did my time on the night shift, and there were definitely some weirder calls during the night shift than the day shift. But this one time I was working the night shift, I didn't get any calls. I was just cruising on a quiet road with no streetlights and woods on both sides. I saw the reflection of taillights suddenly approaching on the right-hand side of the road on the grass. As I got closer, I saw that the driver's side door was open. I started to veer onto the grass as I slowed down, fully planning on getting out to see if the driver needed assistance. I saw someone step out of the car, stand by the door for a second, then started to run into the woods. I radioed the codes for a suspicious person or vehicle, then got out of the car with my flashlight on and my hand on my holster just in case. In this situation, I had to expect the worst. I got to the front door of the car and looked inside, half expecting to see someone else sitting in there, but the car seemed empty. There was a seriously foul odor emanating from inside the car, though. It smelled like a rotting animal. I called out to the woods, asking if anybody's there and needs assistance, and I stepped to the tree line, waving the flashlight around. I went back to the car to take a closer look inside the passenger side. There were multiple bloodied tissues and paper towels on the floor on the passenger side, as well as the rear seats. They were soaked in blood. The entire papers were dark red. At some point while looking inside the car, I heard footsteps inside the woods. I spun around with my flashlight and yelled, "Come out of the woods." I didn't see anyone. Someone was hiding in there, and that was confirmed when I heard a deep voice somewhere beyond the trees and shrubs. I had no idea what the voice said. I responded saying, "Show yourself, are you hurt?" I prepared to unholster my gun as I walked a little closer. I repeated myself, asking, "Are you hurt?" No response. The voice I heard before didn't sound like a person in pain bleeding out. Additionally, why would they run into the woods upon seeing a police car? Something was way off. I went back to the car and requested assistance. I noticed as I investigated the car further that it had no plates, and when I went back inside of the rear, I found something that made me almost puke from shock. There was something heavy wrapped in bloodied paper towel. I unwrapped it with my gloves on to find a severed hand, and it took me a hot second to realize what it was, because it was completely dark red soaked in blood. Now this situation went from a 5 to a 10. I radioed that there was a possible murder and needed backup. I now put my cruiser's lights on to help other officers more easily identify my location. When backup arrived, we did a thorough search of the woods, looking for possible blood trails. Nothing though. There were not even any blood trails leading from the car, which meant that the hand and blood on the tissues I found may not have been from the person who I saw run into the woods. Eventually the canine unit had to come and search for the person. Hours upon hours went into this search, well past dawn, turning up nothing. The vehicle was taken into custody. It had been reported stolen by a resident of a nearby town, who said he had no idea who could have stolen his car. Fingerprints had been collected from the steering wheel, and DNA testing had been done on the hand. There was not a single match to anybody in the database. To this day, there was never any progress in finding out who the driver of that car was and whose severed hand that was. My partner and I are assigned to a unit in the sheriff's department that handles tethers, or ankle monitors. One night while looking for someone that absconded the program, we followed her last known location to a somewhat shady area of our county. Not many stops are routine, but this one was unsettling from the beginning. My partner walked to the front door, as I held the side of the house, keeping my focus on him and the side of the house. After knocking on the door, we could hear movement from inside. As the door opened, a middle-aged woman slowly peered out of the door and looked directly at me. There was no way she knew where I was standing. I was not in view of any window at the front or side of the house. What was strange was that most people would answer the person at the front door, not look at the side of the house first. After a moment, she let us in after we asked if she knew who Camille was, who we were searching for. She mumbled something to the effect that she was there. Things went from 0 to 100 immediately, as she dropped to her hands and knees and started scooting on the floor yelling for Camille. This lady had some obvious mental issues, and we figured this Camille was a caretaker of some kind. We both knew the situation was off, but started searching the house. The entire time this woman was yelling for Camille, never once getting back to her feet, just kind of following us on the ground. The time must have been around 8 p.m. and it was dark outside. The inside of the home had one light on. There were no TVs or any electronics of any kind. The house had a strange feeling to it. The layout of this older style home had about 4 bedrooms and 2 floors. Every time I left a room, I swear I was in a part of the house I had not just been in. I would enter a hallway and seemingly be in another part of the house, like I entered a dimensional gap or something. The woman would sometimes be right behind me without making a sound. I was starting to question how all of this was possible. At one point, we both entered the upstairs, which looked to be a regular upstairs with bedrooms, or maybe a bathroom at the top of the stairs. As we tried to open the door, initially it would not budge. It appeared that it had been sealed somehow, like it had been painted over, and paint had dried in the seams of the door. After putting in a little extra effort, the door opened, revealing an attic, not bedrooms. If you remember Paranormal Activity, when the guy finds a picture of his wife and child in the insulation, that's what it looked like. There was nothing but storage space, insulation, and an older style light bulb with a string hanging from it. The lady was just sitting at the bottom of the stairs watching us, occasionally yelling for Camille. After what seemed like an hour of searching this house over and over again, going into rooms I swear I had just left, we called it and cleared the property. As we drove off, the woman was now standing right in front of the door, staring at us as we left. According to when we called dispatch and when we cleared, we were only there for 20 minutes. It felt like we were there for well over an hour or two. I don't know what was more unsettling, the fact that it was late at night, the lady yelling Camille's name and scooting on her hands and knees, her quietly showing up behind me when I had not heard her move, or the fact that she was standing at the door just staring at us as we left. We have not returned to that house. My family and I live throughout the middle of Georgia. Not many stories come out of this area, and this one I'm about to share makes us glad of that fact. My cousin, who I'll call Bob, has been a police officer for 5 years. He went into the force bright-eyed and optimistic, I guess like so many do. It sounds corny, but he genuinely wanted to make a difference and help improve the lives of the people in his community. One day, they got an alert from a house somewhere between Macon and Roberta. To hear Bob tell it, it was a place that people had thought was abandoned for years. Gives you an idea of the state the house was in. Anyway, when they arrived, an older gentleman was sitting on the steps outside the front door with his hand in his pockets. Bob and the other officer approached him and were alarmed to see that the man was crying. Well, not crying really, but sobbing, and he was also muttering something to himself about how awful it is. They tried to question the man, but the guy was completely incoherent. It didn't take but a couple of seconds to figure out that the poor guy was traumatized. As his partner called for another car, Bob drew his gun and decided to enter the house. The smell inside the house was overpoweringly rancid. He told me that the kitchen and living room were a total wreck. It was clear the owners of the house were hoarders. Pots and pans stacked damn near to the ceiling, spoiled food all over the table, takeout containers scattered all over the floor. Disgusting. As procedure dictates, Bob called out to see if anyone would answer. Silence. He told me that even with all his training and experience over those past 5 years, his heart rate was already building fast. Gun at the ready, he checked out the living room and saw nobody was there either. He made his way down the hall where the smell was getting much worse. Just as it all became too much, he covered his mouth and nose and opened the door to what he suspected was the bedroom. In the bed were 2 corpses, gray-skinned and covered with flies. Despite his churning stomach, Bob decided to go in for a closer look, a decision he said he's regretted since. One of the corpses was male, the other female. The skin on their faces was already starting to fall off, and the flies were flying in and out of their mouths. Some were landing and sitting on their eyeballs. As Bob inspected the female's corpse, he was horrified to find that she was holding an even smaller dead body, an infant. It wasn't until a large cockroach crawled out of the dead infant's mouth that Bob ran outside the house, doubled over, and threw up his lunch all over the steps the man had been sitting on. When the other cars finally arrived, they were able to do a more thorough inspection. The older man that Bob and his partner had met when they first arrived was a former coworker and friend of the dead man. They'd worked together at a peach packing company. The man hadn't showed up for over a week, and he'd gone to their house to see if he was okay. The poor man had been the first to see that horrible sight in the bedroom. The story that they put together was that the wife and husband had at some point become addicted to opioids. After some kind of operation a year or so before, they had started abusing painkillers together, and the addiction grew and grew until they started shooting up and snorting heroin. Their daughter, who wasn't more than a couple years old, had died of neglect. When the husband and wife discovered their baby's corpse, they finally broke completely and decided to end themselves. The coroner found enough heroin in both their bodies to kill them twice over. Bob's still on the force, but he started drinking a little too much after that. He's been going to therapy, and he's since managed to get his drinking under control. But almost every time we talk, he says that he still has nightmares about that poor child's corpse. And in his nightmares, the baby's still crying. I once responded to a call of a possible breaking and entering. A young woman living alone called in fear, saying that she came home to find a broken window downstairs, but nothing seemed to be stolen and she couldn't find anyone inside. But then when she went upstairs to bed, she thought she could hear footsteps moving around downstairs. Her call disconnected shortly after she said that, and the woman wouldn't pick up to any of the attempted callbacks. I took the call and arrived to the little house. I went to knock on the front door, and after a minute, I gave it another set of knocks and pressed the doorbell. After another minute, I tried one more time, this time banging really loudly and ringing the bell again. When there was no answer this time, I decided to inspect the house. I walked around the house, and I found the busted window. It was a window big enough to crawl through with ease. I stuck my head into the dark house and yelled, "It's the police." It was silent. I radioed to dispatch that the house seemed silent. More officers were en route, but I didn't feel right waiting around in case there was someone truly in danger in the house. I radioed that I'm going into the house through the window, and then I climbed through it. I stepped over the shattered glass into the kitchen. I drew my gun and started walking through the kitchen, hearing the glass crunching below my boots. I shouted into the house to make my presence as a police officer known to anyone who was inside. I didn't hear any footsteps, so I went upstairs, as the woman on the phone told dispatch that she heard footsteps downstairs, so that would mean her bedroom was upstairs. I wasn't trying to be too quiet as I went up the stairs, but I also wasn't stomping around. I didn't know what to expect, if someone with a weapon was in the house, or if the woman was just alone in bed. I said, "Ma'am, it's a police officer. Are you here?" And I heard back a soft female voice from upstairs saying yes. I followed the voice to one of the bedrooms, where I saw a woman sitting up in her bed under the covers. She looked at me, and I asked if she was okay. She said she was fine. I noticed a slight tremble in her voice. I kept the lights to the bedroom off as I looked at her. There was enough natural moonlight in the room that I could examine her facial expression. She looked distressed. I told her I was responding to her phone call, and then I asked her why she hung up and didn't pick up the callbacks. She stuttered and said no one is here. I caught on to what was going on. I looked at the closet and made a slight head nod to her. She very slightly shook her head no. I looked down under the bed and pointed, and she shook her head yes. The weight of the pressure of what to do next was 1,000 pounds. The best idea I came up with on the spot was telling her, "All right, ma'am, I just need you to sign this report form stating that I was here and there was nothing unusual." She said okay and got up from the bed and came over to me. And when she was close enough, I pushed her out of the room and then drew my gun and yelled, "Come out from under the bed." I was still shook when I saw a dark figure actually slowly coming out from under the bed. I said, "Hands first and drop any weapons." I heard the clank of something drop to the floor, which turned out to be a gun. A middle-aged man in all black clothes stepped out from under the bed with his hands up. I made the arrest on the spot and brought him outside, right around the time the other officers were arriving. The woman had hung up the phone on the police when she thought the footsteps were upstairs and she didn't want the intruder to hear the audio from the phone call. This was also why she didn't pick up the phone, because by this point the intruder entered the room and had her at gunpoint. And since the police were already coming, for whatever reason, instead of fleeing the scene, the intruder threatened to shoot the woman if she made a sound when the police came. After I had rung the bell, he hid under the bed and told her to pretend he wasn't there. I'm glad I was able to catch on to the situation. It could have gone a number of ways if I hadn't.